Hello there, Timur Podcast fans. In listening to this exceptional show, I gather there's at least one warlord from history that fascinates you, which is great, because if that's true, maybe you have an appetite to learn about others. I'm Mark Pimenta, the host of the Warlords of History podcast, the focus of which is on people, ancient and medieval, those defined by the term warlord. Intriguing warriors and leaders, some well known, others a little more obscure, but all that were titans during their respective ages. When I select a particular warlord, over the course of several episodes, I plan to review their lifetime and actions, but also take this further by looking at the environmental and political conditions right before their lifetime. We'll explore their motivations for taking on the mantle of war. We'll cover what they did and how they did it, and finally, what their legacy was beyond their demise. So, if any of this interests you, join me as we dive into each of their lifetimes, their worlds, in the Warlords of History podcast.
In today's episode, I'm going to do things a little differently. I'm going to begin by diving into a bit of modern politics and geography that will loosely tie in with Timur. However, if you'd rather just get straight back into where we left off with Timur's story, I totally understand. James from the future will be here shortly to tell you where to skip to in the episode. This is James from the future, which is still the past for you. But anyway, if you want to get straight to Timur, I would skip to about 2250 or so. Give or take a few seconds. Okay, are they gone? They're so shallow. What do they think this is? A podcast about Timur's history? They should know better by now. Okay, anyway, let's get into this. The Timur Podcast is not a political podcast. Or I should say, this is a very political podcast, but not a modern political podcast. I will never tell you who I voted for or where I stand on current political issues. That's not the point here. That's not why you're here, and if I'm being honest, I don't know enough about so many hot topic issues to feel comfortable enough to share even if I wanted to. With that being said though, as we all know, to understand any current issue in really any place in the world, it is beneficial and perhaps even essential to knowing the history behind it. Understanding the past always helps us to understand the present. But what I've found is that sometimes in order to understand the past, it helps to know about the present. The system goes both ways. We are forever linked with the deeds of our ancestors, and in a way, they were connected to us. So in today's episode, we're going to begin a bit differently than how we normally start. This isn't going to become the norm. Who knows? It could fall down flat on its face, but we're going to give it a try anyway. We're going to look just a bit into the current politics of Egypt. Now, don't worry, I promise that this does go back to Timur, but again, there's a really interesting connection between modern Egypt and where we are in the story of Timur. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take a look. Now, before we begin, a quick disclaimer. I am by no means an expert on current affairs in the Middle East or North Africa or really anywhere for that matter, so take all of this with a heavy dose of salt. I've done a bit of research, but the point of this little dive is to relate back to Timur's story rather than me claiming to know the intricacies of modern Egyptian politics. And with that in mind, since my knowledge is lacking, I'm not going to make too many claims on political solutions or moral understandings for Egypt in 2021. I am definitely not the guy for that job. Instead of posing ideas for the future, I want to look at Egypt as it is right now and then tie that back in with Timur. So just bear with me. Regardless of the era in human history, Egypt has always been one of the most influential and important regions on Earth. We all know just how important ancient Egypt was, one of the birthplaces of civilization, the pharaohs, the pyramids, etc. But seriously, dig into any era in human history and Egypt will always be involved. Whether it's the German North African campaigns in World War II, or the 20th century conflicts between Egypt and Israel, or the complicated relationship between the Romans and Cleopatra, or the role of the Suez Canal in current trade routes, or, as we discussed many episodes ago, how it was the Egyptians who inflicted one of the first major defeats on the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut. All this to say, Egypt will forever be important. Today, Egypt has a population of about 100,000 million people and the 34th largest economy in the world.
Okay, I hate to do this, but I need to. While editing and while listening back through this, I noticed a big problem, and that is that the current population of Egypt is not 100,000 million people. I don't know how I didn't catch that. It's 100 million people, which is a drastically different number. Now, unfortunately, I am not home. I don't have access to a microphone, and that's why this sounds terrible. But I wanted to make that clear. There are not 100,000 million. I don't even know what that number means. There are only 100 million people-ish living in Egypt today. Okay, thanks. Let's get back to it.
Politically speaking, the affairs of Egypt in the past decade or so have been complicated. In 2011 and 2012, Egypt, along with many other countries in the era, experienced massive political unrest due to the Arab Spring. There's, of course, quite a bit to the Arab Spring in Egypt, but the quick notes are that hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets unhappy with the state of Egypt. This resulted in a police crackdown on the population, with thousands of people being incarcerated, wounded, and even killed. But in the end, President Mubarak was overthrown and the Egyptian military took over. This eventually led to President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi taking power in 2014, and he is still the president today. But political unrest in Egypt is still quite rampant due to complaints about fair elections, police and military brutality, what role Islam plays in all of this, economic development, and, as you can imagine, so many other issues. Right now, though, Egypt is ranked as the 34th most unstable country in the world. While there are certainly many who do support President al-Sisi's regime, there are also many reports of rigged elections, further militarization of an already very militarized police force, imprisonment and torture, extrajudicial killings, the destruction of homes and property by the state, disappearance, and the silence of any speech contrary to the state. Now, again, I don't know enough about this to make a claim whether or not Egypt was better off during Mubarak than it is now. I'm not here to make a claim based on my limited knowledge, but I want you to be aware of two things about modern Egypt. First of all, there has been and is a growing divide between the government and the people. And interestingly enough, in the past few years, the Egyptian government announced that it would be constructing an entirely new capital city just outside the current capital of Cairo. The name of this new city is currently the New Administrative Capital, and construction is currently ongoing. One of the primary reasons given for this project is to alleviate the congestion of the population of Cairo, as Cairo is currently one of the most congested cities in the world, and its population only continues to grow rapidly. Now, again, I want to make this very clear. I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing for the people of Egypt. But anytime a capital is moved in order to escape a more congested area, you have to wonder how the people will take this. But the second and more important issue facing Egypt today is the one I want to focus on. This is an issue that is and likely will affect all of us, and it's the issue that will also tie in with Timur when we get to that in just a bit. To understand Egypt at any point in history, there is one element that is always the source of life for the country. This is, of course, the Nile River. The Nile River is what brings so much life into a region that would otherwise be quite inhospitable to human flourishing. Most of us know about the Nile. We've all heard about just how vital it always has been. Well, imagine this. What would the history of Egypt look like if the Nile's size was reduced by 90%? Would the pyramids have ever been constructed if the Nile was only 10% of what we know it as today? Would Egypt have been the breadbasket of the Roman Empire? Obviously, things would have been quite different. The Nile has been, is, and likely forever will be the lifeblood of Egypt. Today, though, there's a very problematic issue facing... Oh, what was that? Oh, the house is probably collapsing. Anyway, there's a very problematic issue facing the Nile River, and thus facing everybody who lives directly on the Nile, but also indirectly impacting all of us, no matter where we live. The Nile River is generally considered to be the longest river in the world, reaching well over 4,000 miles. As such, the Nile ends its flow in Egypt where it reaches the Mediterranean Sea, but it also flows through the Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Congo, Kenya, and several other countries. The biggest source of the Nile is Lake Victoria, but much of it also comes from the various rivers and mountain runoff in Ethiopia, and here is where the issue originates. In 2011, Ethiopia began construction on what it calls the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is being built on the Blue Nile River, which is a river that eventually connects to the Nile proper. Once completed, it is hoped that this dam will create enough electricity for most of Ethiopia, solving much of Ethiopia's energy shortage crisis, as well as producing electricity that could be exported to other African countries. If completed, this dam will be the 7th largest hydroelectric plant in the world. And that sounds pretty spectacular, but here's where things get really complicated. Egypt, in addition to other Nile countries, but especially Egypt, is very concerned that this dam will significantly decrease the amount of water that flows down the Nile, which will, in turn, decrease the size of the Nile in Egypt. And as we know, the Nile is the lifeblood, the veins of Egypt. Now, there are compelling arguments from all sides, and again, I encourage you to look into this issue yourself because I am not someone to... Well, I don't know enough about it, but the problem is, that I do know, is that scientific debate can take a lot longer than an alternate answer, and that answer is war. For the past 9 years or so, Egypt and Ethiopia have tried talking about various solutions with different world powers trying to help reach resolution, but with every passing year, it appears that peaceful resolution is becoming less of the likely option, with both countries preparing for a violent outcome. In October of 2019, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia publicly stated, "No force can stop Ethiopia from building a dam. If there is need to go to war, we could get millions readied." And as recent as September of 2020, President Trump predicted that Egypt will try to bomb the dam in the near future. That's clear to everybody. And to make the situation even more complicated, along with Egypt, Ethiopia is also experiencing quite a lot of internal strife. Ethnic clashes, political protests, the postponing of elections until an undisclosed date, and of course COVID-19 have all taken their toll on stability. And then this past November, the Tigray War broke out between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which has led to the deaths of thousands and the displacement of over 2 million people. And lingering through all of this internal violence within both Egypt and Ethiopia, among the complicated external politics, such as who controls the Suez Canal, among this all is the existence of the Nile River. The human relationship with water is such a basic thing that we all understand, and yet it can so easily erupt into something like international war. Now again, I don't know the issues well. I don't know who's in the right here or who's in the wrong. I don't know enough to feel confident to make some sort of claim. But the thing is, this is looking more and more like it's going to end in full-scale war. I don't know, but I wanted to dive into this a bit because this is an issue that might affect all of us quite a bit in the near future, and also to remind us just how important something like a river can be to entire countries, entire civilizations. And that brings us to a region in Central Asia where water is also vital. We all know about ancient Egypt because the Nile allowed Egypt to become one of the birthplaces of civilization, being part of the famous Fertile Crescent. But there was another region in Asia that was quite similar to Egypt in that powerful rivers and lakes gave birth to civilization. This region goes by many names, but we will refer to it as Chorasmia. And although Chorasmia was, at times, rival to places like Egypt or Babylon in so many ways, it never gets the same sort of historical spotlight and is often ignored completely altogether. There are many reasons why Chorasmia is forgotten or ignored, but one of the main reasons is the recent history of Chorasmia has been hard on the people and the societies there. And this brings us back to what I said at the very beginning of this episode. Understanding the present can help illuminate the past. The reason why we talked about Egypt and the Nile is, well, first of all, I just learned about this issue of the dam in Ethiopia, and I know a lot of my family and friends have no idea what's going on, and it's very important. This is a tinderbox in a lot of ways that is dangerous. I'm going off script here, but if you don't know about it, I encourage you to look into it because it's one of those issues in the world that doesn't seem to get enough attention for what it is. But I also wanted to talk about Egypt and the Nile because imagine if the Nile was reduced by 90% of its size. Now, to be completely clear, nobody thinks the Ethiopian dam would reduce the Nile even close to that amount. But imagine if it did. What would become of Egypt? Well, unfortunately, perhaps we can look to the region of Chorasmia for an answer. Chorasmia is one of many names for the region that sat directly below the Aral Sea in Central Asia. Much like how the Nile flowed into the Mediterranean, creating the Nile Delta, a wonderful place for civilization to spring forth from, Chorasmia was similar. The Amu Darya and the Sur Darya, two rivers we've talked quite a bit about, flowed into the Aral Sea, creating a delta that was one, in the middle of deserts, and two, wonderful for agriculture. And agriculture brings civilization. Archaeological evidence shows us that people were living and growing crops here as early as 5000 or 6000 BCE. And Chorasmian civilization would only continue to rapidly increase, becoming a region rich in trade and culture and known throughout all the ancient world. This was a region that became the beating heart of the Silk Road, connecting the Greek and Hellenistic worlds, Egypt, Arabia, Babylon, Persia, Scythia, China, and India. It all flowed through Chorasmia. And with the wealth came power. Chorasmian soldiers became, renowned for their heavy infantry and heavy cavalry, with Chorasmian mercenaries even making an appearance during the Second Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BCE. Chorasmia would be the home of many independent, rich states. It was an important part of the mighty Kushan Empire. It was one of the richest provinces of the various Persian empires, and it was always sought as a prize by its neighbors. During the early Middle Ages, Chorasmia was conquered and converted to Islam by the Umayyad Caliphate in the 710s AD, and then would pass between other powerful factions, such as the Abbasids, the Great Seljuks, the Ghaznavids, and the Karakutai, and others, to name just a few. But through these thousands of years, Chorasmia was one of the most richest, I'm really doing well with the words, Chorasmia was one of the richest and most powerful regions on Earth. So why, and I am speaking as a Westerner here, but why do we so rarely hear about it? Why does it have to sit to the sidelines while Egypt and Persia and Greece and China get so much attention? As they should. But why is Chorasmia a name that so few people know? Well, this gets back to understanding the present. And in particular, we need to look briefly at the history of the Aral Sea. If you're at a place where you can pause the episode, I encourage you to do so. Jump onto Wikipedia and look up the Aral Sea, spelled A-R-A-L. I will tell you more about the history, but I want you to just look at the satellite pictures at the top of the page. You will see two before and after pictures of what the sea looked like 60 or 70 or so years ago, and throughout most of human history, and then next to it, what the sea looks like today. If you were to visit the Aral Sea in 1940, or really any time before that, you would find the fourth largest lake in the world, full of waters teeming with all sorts of marine life, and waves stretching seemingly endlessly in all directions. The Aral Sea was massive, covering approximately 26,000 square miles, or 68,000 square kilometers, which roughly is the same size as Ireland. It was this sea, fed by the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers, that gave so much life to the region of Chorasmia for thousands of years. Fishing, the production of cotton from the irrigated fields, and the growing of fruit such as melons and pomegranates became economic staples of this region. While Central Asia was under the control of the Soviet Union, for example, the fishing industry in the Aral Sea alone caught nearly 1/6 of all fish consumed by the Union. However, if you were to stand on the edge of the Aral Sea today, you'd find something quite different. From the 1950s until the late 1990s, the Aral Sea shrunk in size nearly 90%. Only about a tenth of the sea was left. With this decrease in water, the salt content of the sea exploded to the point that what was left of the Aral Sea was more than 10 times saltier than the oceans. And because of this, marine life was forever devastated, with nearly 20 types of fish disappearing from the sea altogether. The fishing industry, which had once been one of the main economic pillars of the region, completely collapsed. Fishing villages and cities that were built on the sea are now miles, if not hundreds of miles, from actual water. The desert, where the water once was, is now an infamous boat graveyard with all sorts of vessels abandoned in the dried out dirt. So, how on earth did this happen? Well, the answer is of course quite complicated, but the short story is that during the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet government, which ruled over Central Asia, embarked on what was called the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature. Because famines were quite regular occurrences in the early history of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin believed that by diverting the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers into agricultural fields, this would help alleviate the shortage of food. Of course, this meant that most of the rivers would not reach the Aral Sea, thus leading, eventually, to 90% of the Aral Sea disappearing over the course of a few decades. While the program did increase food output in the region, the Aral Sea was forever changed. This was not a surprise to the Soviet government. They had expected this to happen, but the ecosystem and the livelihoods of many of the people here were absolutely devastated. And today, the destruction of the Aral Sea is typically regarded as one of the planet's worst environmental disasters ever. You'll also hear it called the Silent Chernobyl. Now, there is some good news. The world has been trying to repair the sea during the past 2 decades or so. Some of the water has been restored, some fish life has returned, and Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan are working together to try and repair the ecosystem. For example, each of those countries I just named gives about 1% of their budget solely to repairing the sea. And for the entire country's budget, 1% is actually a decent amount. But still, the sea is still only a shadow of the glorious body of water it once was. So why do I bring this up? How on earth do Soviet irrigation programs relate to Timur? Well, part of the reason why we might not have learned about the region of Chorasmia in our history books is because the region has been so decimated in recent years. The land of what was Chorasmia is nowhere near the political or economic importance on today's theater than, say, during the time of Timur. And that's why I wanted to dive a bit into present history, because while we talk about Timur's multiple wars against Chorasmia, I want us to remember that this wasn't a desolate region wrecked by the destruction of the Aral Sea, trying to navigate the economic fallout of disastrous Soviet programs. No. Chorasmia was the exact opposite. Chorasmia was Egypt, it was Babylon, it was the Indus Valley. It was a heavily populated, extremely rich, powerful, fertile land that was one of the biggest players in Asian history for centuries. That was the Chorasmia of Timur's day, a land brought to life by the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers, and then of course by the Aral Sea, a land that any conqueror would love to add to his collection. And Chorasmia had certainly seen its fair share of conquerors. If we go back a few hundred years before Timur's birth, in the early 1100s, the mighty Seljuk Empire was on its last legs, splitting into many various factions and crumbling under its own weight. Out of the region of Chorasmia came a new power, one that history would remember as the Khwarezmian Empire, or the Shahdom of Khwarezm. Again, you'll hear Khwarezmia pronounced several different ways. There's also different names for this country. I'm going to stick with Khwarezmia. Anyway, for about a century, this new power would be fueled by the wealth and the manpower of its lands, and would carve for itself one of the largest empires in the world at this time. It is difficult to put dates on when the Khwarezmian Empire began, as for many years its leaders were subject to other dynasties, such as the Karakatai or the Ghaznavids. Thus, you'll often see the year 1077 AD given as the beginning of the Khwarezmian state, but it really wasn't until about 1200 AD or so until they became a completely autonomous state. But once they did, they were a great power in a world that was a gigantic power vacuum. So the Khwarezmians went to war, eating up the leftover pettier states left behind the collapse of the Seljuks. From about 1190 until 1219, these years marked the glory years of the Khwarezmian Empire. And to tie this back into Timur, who will be born 130 years later or so, Khwarezmia was situated on the Amu Darya and the Sur Darya rivers. Just like Mawarnar, Timur's homeland was farther southeast. These two regions, although separate, were neighbors. They shared the same water resources, and they had histories that often intertwined. Keep this in mind when we get to Timur in just a few minutes. Anyway, although the Khwarezmian Empire was fantastic, it unfortunately found itself sort of in the wrong place and certainly in the wrong time. For a new power had been rising. We talked about this many episodes ago, but as the Khwarezmian Empire was expanding nearly 150 years before Timur's birth, Genghis Khan was busy in the east, uniting the Mongol tribes, waging war on his neighbors, and expanding the Mongolian borders to the borders of the Khwarezmian Empire. And whether it was because the Khwarezmians killed Mongolian diplomats, or whether this story was made up to justify his actions, Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 AD. As the Persian historian Atta Malik Juvani ominously wrote about this, when news of these happenings reached the ear of Genghis Khan, the fire of wrath so set him upon the hurricane of violence that with the water of destruction and perdition, he annihilated the very soil of the Sultan's empire. And long story short, the Khwarezmian Empire was destroyed by the Mongols in a mere 2 years or so. It would hold on for a decade in various sort of guerrilla campaigns, but by 1231, the Khwarezmian Empire was finished. And as we've gone over, the Mongol Empire would continue to expand and then would be broken into the 4 khanates. In the time between Genghis Khan and Timur, the region of Khwarezmia fell right in between 2 of these khanates, and was often a point of contention between them. In the early years, Khwarezmia was under the control of the Golden Horde. However, in 1264, the Chagatai Khanate conquered the region and took it from the Horde. Fighting between the 2 khanates continued until finally Khwarezmia was divided. The northern part, centered around the city of Urgench, was given to the Golden Horde, and the southern portion, around the cities of Khiva and Kath, fell to the Chagatai Khanate. But as both khanates weakened, neither was able to station enough manpower in Khwarezmia to keep it in Mongolian hands. And this brings us back to Timur. In about the year 1360, while Timur was first making a name for himself, fighting the Moguls alongside Hussein, his neighbor of Khwarezmia was also undergoing significant change. In this same year, 1360, 10 years before Timur would take the throne, a Turkic chief named Hussein Sufi, living in Khwarezmia, took advantage of the dismal states of the Khanates and announced that Khwarezmia was an independent state, free of any Mongol rule. This new kingdom is usually called the Sufi dynasty of Khwarezmia, and it would survive for about 20 years, and it would be a regular enemy of Timur, and that's why we're focusing so much on Khwarezmia. So as we get into Timur's war with Khwarezmia soon, we have to remember that Khwarezmia was no backwater, desolate region. This was Khwarezmia, and that was a name that everybody knew. There was weight with it, and even though the Mongol invasions 150 years before had destroyed so much of this region and the people living there, Khwarezmia had bounced back almost instantly. We heard last episode how the region of Mogulistan had been made desolate by constant wars to the point where entire villages were found uninhabited. Well, in Khwarezmia, the situation was the opposite. New life and wealth and power was here. Ibn Battuta, the famous African and explorer and historian, passed through Khwarezmia on one of his travels at about this time. In the city of Urgench, which had been sacked by Genghis Khan only a few decades prior, in this city, Ibn Battuta found levels of wealth and prosperity the likes he had only seen in Baghdad and Cairo. He wrote about his visit to Chorasmia and said this, quote, "Tables were brought in with roasted fowls, cranes, young pigeons, baked bread with butter, biscuits, and sweet meats, which were followed by other tables with fruits, pomegranates prepared for the table, some of them served in vessels of glass with wooden spoons, and wonderful melons. On our return to the academy, the emir sent us rice, flour, sheep butter, spices, and loads of wood." Ibn Battuta was just dumbfounded that this region, which had been flattened by the Mongols, was already so quickly rebuilt and so quickly flourishing. And again, a lot of that is due to the Aral Sea, to the Amu Darya and Sur Darya rivers. There's another wonderful story that comes with Ibn Battuta's journal, and that was he had to postpone leaving the city of Urgench simply because he couldn't ride his horse through the marketplace. It was so crowded with customers and merchants and slaves. And in addition to all of this wealth, Khwarezmian culture was also booming, with theological discussion, poetry, architecture, and history all taking off. Thus, this was no Mogulistan, a desolate steppe region devoid of trader settlements. This was Khwarezmia, one of the richest areas anywhere near Mawarnar, anywhere near Timur. So, now that we're nearly 4,500 words into this thing, let us return to the story of Timur. The year is about 1372. Timur has been on the throne for roughly 2 years. He has just returned from his initial campaigns in Mogulistan, and the rebellions of Zinda Hisham and Amir Musa were eventually crushed. But as I'm sure you're tired of me saying by now, the pressure nearly drowning Timur from the tribes that he rules over, that's his biggest enemy. The tribes need to be satisfied. Time is completely against him. Timur needed to be on the warpath yesterday. So where does he focus the attention of the tribes? Where next does Timur's arrow land? Well, yes, it's the land of Chorasmia. Now, this was absolutely the logical choice for Timur's next campaign, for several reasons. First of all, Khwarezmia and Mawarnar were not only neighbors, but they were both on the Amu Darya and the Sur Darya rivers. And as we spent the first 25 minutes or so of this episode talking about, we know how important controlling rivers is. We learned that. We got that. Anyway, further, Khwarezmia was rich, both culturally and materialistically. Mirza Muhammad, one historian who wrote about Timur, compared Khwarezmia and Mawarnar at this time with this. Now remember, Khwarezmia is this rich land that Timur is thinking about conquering, and Mawarnar is Timur's own land. So Mirza Muhammad says this, "And the people of Khwarezmia equal those of Samarkand in subtlety, but excel them in magnificence and elegance, being devoted to poetry and humane learning, admirable in various kinds of fine art and accomplishments, especially in the science of music and tone, which is practiced equally by the nobles and the commoners." So as Mirza suggests, this is a region that is greater than what Timur controls now, which means it would be a very nice place to incorporate into what is now his growing regime. But further, it also means that if Timur leaves Khwarezmia unchecked, it would only grow stronger and may even invade his land later down the road. Perhaps a preemptive strike is wise for Timur. And finally, Khwarezmia and Mawarnar also shared the recent history of being conquered by the Mongols and then being ruled by the Chagatai Khanate afterwards. And since the mere memory of the Mongols and of the Khans and of the Khanates was so present among all the people who had endured the Mongol yoke, Timur could use this to his advantage. After all, this is Timur, the son-in-law to Genghis Khan. He is the successor. In this line of thinking, Khwarezmia rightfully belongs to him. And Hussein Sufi, the man who rules Khwarezmia, he was a Turk and no descendant of Genghis Khan. So who would he be to defy the Khan's inheritance? Thus, in the year 1372, Timur sent Hussein Sufi an ambassador who delivered a message. The message was essentially, submit to Timur, surrender your young realm to Timur, and not only will you be richly rewarded and allowed to rule in his name, but also, as Yazdi from the Zafarnama retells, quote, so that union and peace might be kept up between the two crowns, and that he might enjoy Timur's protection. Now, put yourself in the shoes of Hussein Sufi, ruler of this new independent realm of Chorasmia. What is your response to this? It wasn't your father or your clan who established this kingdom and then ruled it for 10 years. It was you. Your army is strong, your lands are rich, the settled peoples are happy you've protected them from nomadic raiders, and the walls of your cities are tall and strong. After all, this is Chorasmia. Why on earth should you bow to this pesky upstart who's only been on the throne upriver for 2 years or so? But wait, it even gets better for you. Do you remember the man Kaikusra, a powerful leader of part of the Kudalani tribe? We talked about him a few episodes ago, but this was one of Timur's first powerful allies, and it was also this Kaikusra who reintroduced Timur with the Mughals on good terms, thus allowing Timur to use Mughal manpower to finish the fight against Hussein. Anyway, this Kaikusra had always been an ally and a friend to Timur, but he was getting worried about just how fast Timur was consolidating power. Thus, we're told that getting wind of this message, Kaikusra sent Hussein Sufi a message of his own. The message encouraged Hussein to resist Timur, for when the moment was right and Timur was at his most vulnerable, Kaikusra would switch sides, betray Timur, and then both he and Hussein Sufi would defeat Timur once and for all. Thus, hearing this, and with the secure position of his kingdom, Hussein Sufi told the ambassador to return to Timur with an answer. Yazdi tells us what this answer was. But this prince persisted in his resolution, and without considering the valor of the soldiers of Chagatai, the consequences of which he ought to have feared, he answered Timur with this: that he had conquered these countries with the sword, and that Timur might take them the same way, if he could. On my notes next to this quote, I wrote, "Oh, snap," but of course I used a different S word, which I won't say on the air. Okay, yes, fine, the word was sandwich, how did you know? Anyway, once this ambassador was sent back to Timur, Hussein Sufi prepared for war. He ordered the cities to fortify their walls, take in stores of food, and prepare for the inevitable. For the challenge to war had been given, and as historian Hilda Hookham says, Timur readily accepted the challenge. In Mawarnar, the call to war was given. The tribes were told to assemble at Samarkand, and Timur set his eyes west. But before the war broke out, we're given a short, rather odd story. Now, to me, this sounds like propaganda added later in order to try and justify Timur's actions. This comes from Yazdi's Zafarnama, which is about as pro-Timur as you can get. But whatever the case, I will include it here, and you can decide how you feel about it. So here's the story. As Timur is preparing for the invasion, we're told that a religious leader from Timur's home city of Kesh asked for an audience before Timur. This man was named Mullah Gahaladdin and was well respected by Timur, so Timur allowed him to speak. Mullah asked Timur for permission to go to Chorasmia in order to try and convince Hussein Sufi to submit to Timur without any bloodshed. There's a great line in which Mullah says that one man's folly should not damn an entire people. So Timur agrees to this, Mullah goes, and he delivers this message. And here's where it gets a little too much for me. We're told that upon hearing this message, all the wise and learned men in Chorasmia agreed with Mullah and begged Hussein Sufi to surrender. But Hussein Sufi, resolute in his doomed ways, threw Mullah into a dungeon. Thus, this was yet another reason for Timur to invade. Now, did this happen? Possibly. Is this a fictional story added later as more justification for Timur's invasion? Might be. We'll probably never know, but I wanted to include it anyway. So with that said, and once Timur had gathered his army, the first invasion of Chorasmia in 1372 began. This will not be the last invasion of Chorasmia. The last one will not come for several years. Timur marched his army down the rivers until he reached Khwarezmian territory. Here, on the banks of the Amu Darya, Timur encountered enemy scouts and the two sides began skirmishing. This was not a full-scale battle, but Timur's forces did win the skirmish. Yazdi describes what happened next with this. They met the enemy's scouts whom they attacked and vanquished. Having bound their hands, they brought them to the camp as the first fruits of the victory they would probably obtain this campaign. And then the men were all beheaded. And it's scenarios like this in which our pro-Timur sources are extremely valuable to us. If somebody like Yazdi, who is very pro-Timur, if somebody like him goes out of his way to recount how prisoners of war were brought before Timur and then beheaded, then there's a good chance that this happened. Now, yes, the killing of war prisoners was not nearly as universally shunned as it is today, but still, anytime pro-Timur sources tell us something morally reprehensible that Timur did, that's probably the closest we can get to verifying that they happened, at least without, archaeology or other types of science and things like that. And similarly, anytime our anti-Timur sources mention something good or effective he did, chances are that's true as well, and we will continue to see these instances. I'll point them out as we progress. Anyways, once this skirmish was complete, Timur continued his advance. It was clear that Hussein Sufi was going to fight a defensive war. After all, battle always favors the defender. His cities were excellently defended, and Timur's nomadic warriors preferred fighting on the open plain on horseback rather than, shall we say, climbing a rickety ladder over a wall while being pelted with missiles. And then, of course, Hussein Sufi also knew that he had allies in Timur's own camp, that being the man Kaikusra of the Kudalani tribe, who was waiting for that opportune moment to switch sides. The first major city in Chorasmia that Timur reached was the city of Kath, or Kat. Today, Kath is known as the city of Bruni. It was renamed to this in 1957 in order to honor a famous medieval scholar named Al-Biruni, who was born here. Again, that's just another reminder that this was an area where scholars were born, where they congregated, and where learning thrived. Anyway, the city of Bruni today has a population of about 66,000 people or so, and it's located in central Uzbekistan. But in 1372, Kath was one of the largest and most important cities in Khwarezmia, and as Timur's forces approached the city, they found its walls tall, well-built, defenders lining the battlements, and inside the population was well-stocked for a siege. Further, surrounding the walls was this large ditch, making approach to the walls basically suicide. And even if his men managed to get to the walls, Timur didn't have a single engineer in his ranks. He couldn't destroy the walls, he would have to go over them. Now, when Genghis Khan attacked this city and the other cities in Khwarezmia 150 years earlier, he only felt comfortable enough to do this because he had whole hosts of Chinese engineers who were their sole purpose was taking down walls. Timur doesn't have that. Taking this city would be a nightmare. But again, how many of his own men did Timur have to fear? Tens? Hundreds? Thousands? If he shows any weakness, such as a failed campaign, he's done. He's gone. This was life and death for Timur. If he wanted any hope to succeed, then he needed to live up to his name. He needed to be as firm and resolute as iron. There was no going back. And so the siege of Kath began. Timur's thousands of warriors encircled the city. That part was easy. They were on horseback on an open plain. But now what? There's no time for a siege. Hussein Sufi could arrive with reinforcements at any time, and more critically, Timur's men might turn on him with every passing day. Thus, Timur ordered the one thing he had to do. He told his men to assault. They dismounted their horses, which was where they were more comfortable, how they knew how to fight, and now they're on their own 2 feet, told to construct ladders and then commanded to scale the walls. Yazdi says this: "The imperial troops, having enveloped the town, assaulted it with the utmost vigor, and as the attacks were going forward and both sides were hot, there was no time for the treating of peace. Arrows and stones fell from the town upon our army like rain." Now, imagine that you are one of Timur's soldiers. You're standing on your own 2 feet, something you are highly uncomfortable with in battle. And now, as you're running towards the walls, you find yourself in a steep and wide ditch, which you have to clamber down and then up again, all the while somehow holding your weapons and possibly a ladder while you're crawling through the rocks. Oh, and all the while, of course, you're being bombarded with arrows and rocks. You're hearing the men around you fall, screaming in agony. Men you know, men you grew up with, your tribesmen. And now, as you somehow manage to drag this ladder up the side of the embankment, you have to gather your composure and your strength because that was the easy part. Now you have to place the ladder, climb it, dodge the missiles, and then get on top of that wall. And while you're in that precarious position of transitioning from the top rung of the ladder onto the wall, you can bet that every single defender is trying to stab you. The first men over the ladders almost never survived. And as you're trying to place the ladder, you notice the men around you, those who are alive anyway, retreating back away from the walls, back to the camp, and before you know it, you're among them, climbing back through the ditch, pushing aside your wounded companions who you must leave behind. The first assault on Kath, if it can even be called an assault, it was a disaster. Timur's casualties were massive. So Timur immediately ordered a new plan. Have as many men as possible cut down any trees or reeds or other foliage that might be in the area. Then the attack would resume, but in 2 parts. The first part would be to fill the ditch with as many logs and bushes and anything else that they could find. And we're not told this, but I can imagine that this ditch was already partially filled with bodies, both dead and on their last breaths. Now imagine going back under heavy missile fire again, throwing logs that you're carrying down into the ditch below, crushing and suffocating any poor souls who had fallen in the previous assault and who hadn't experienced the mercy of death yet. But this is what you're expected to do in this first step, and again, that's the easy part. The second step of Timur's new plan is navigating through the now mostly filled ditch and then placing the ladders against the wall again and somehow getting onto those walls alive. How on earth do you, as Timur, convince men whose loyalty is highly questionable at best, men who have just been defeated at these same walls and who saw their friends and sons and brothers and fathers shot to pieces here, how do you convince them to try this again? Well, Timur employs 2 powerful strategies. First, he promises his soldiers that the first man over those walls will be rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. This is definitely a good move on Timur's part, but he needs to do something more. But this is Timur we're talking about, and he knows exactly what his men need. He has to lead them personally. And so, the second assault is ordered. The ditch has to be filled. But the men are ready. They have the supplies. And then, there at the front of their ranks is Timur himself, in his own armor, ready to go through the same hell he expected his men to face. And so it begins. The charge forward into the range of the missiles, the rain of the arrows falling upon the attackers, the filling of the ditch with anything available, which no doubt took quite a bit of time, and right there, in the midst of it, is Timur himself, using his own shield to deflect arrows, using his own voice to give the men direct orders. And yes, this does come primarily from Yazdi, so maybe this is made up in order to show just how glorious Timur was. But here's the thing. There are so many accounts of Timur engaged in the actual battles that I don't deny it. And further, what other than Timur being there in that hell would convince his men to obey? Maybe it's fictitious, but I'm confident enough to go with this narrative. And so, back to the battle, the first stage is completed. The ditch is filled, and now the men are able to get to the wall, and the ladders are placed there, with Timur's men scrambling up them, trying to be the first to reach glory. Now, if Yazdi really wanted to glorify Timur, he might have said that Timur was the first up the ladders, slaying Chorasmian troops left and right, yada yada yada, but that's not what we're told. Timur doesn't climb the ladders. We're instead given the accounts of the other men who tried to be the first up onto the walls. Timur ordered one man personally to lead the assault. Get up the ladders, do this. But this guy was overcome with fear, which is totally understandable given the survival rates of being the first dude on the ladder. So this man turned and ran. Soon thereafter, two other men started to get near the top of their ladder, successfully dodging spear thrusts and blocking arrows with their shields. But just as they neared the top, the man on the bottom, perhaps losing his balance and needing support, perhaps out of jealousy, reached out and grabbed the ankle of the man above him. This caused both men to lose their balance, falling off of the siege ladder and crashing to the ground below where they perished. And then a soldier by the name of Sheikh Ali reached the top of his ladder. Yazdi describes what happens with this. Sheikh Ali returned and had success, at which one of the enemies came with his lance in hand to repulse him. But this brave man, snatching it from him, broke it and then struck him upon the head with his sword. Sheikh Ali leapt over the wall and began holding off the defenders as more and more of Timur's men began to pour onto the walls now that the ice had been broken, if you will, of this defense. Within a few minutes, this trickle of attackers became a flood, with the defenders quickly losing confidence now that their walls were basically nullified. Eventually, the walls were secure enough so that a gate could be opened, and with the opening of the gate, the city was doomed. Timur's forces, which outnumbered the defenders, poured in through the gate over the walls where more and more ladders were being placed. And although the battle continued through the streets and the alleys, house by house, back through the marketplaces and to the main square, the result was inevitable. The city of Kath, one of the mightiest in Chorasmia, had fallen to Timur. And once the defenders were adequately silenced, the sacking of the city began. This is how Yazdi describes it. They put the greatest part of those who had defended the city to the sword, as also of the inhabitants whose wives and children they carried away for slaves, after having pillaged whatsoever they could find. Since this is one of the first of many cities that Timur will sack, that's all I'm going to say here. It gets difficult to focus on the atrocities carried out when we know that this is just the introduction to the next 33 years of Timur's conquests. But suffice to say, Kath was left desolate. Timur's soldiers were reinvigorated with the loot and the victory. Timur was a bit safer for the time being. Sheikh Ali, the man who had been the first over the wall, somehow survived the fighting and was brought before Timur, who personally showered him with gifts and made sure to show all of his men just how much he was willing to reward bravery and sacrifice. As for the man who had run when Timur ordered him over the ditch and up the walls, this man was tied to the tail of a donkey and dragged all the way back to Samarkand. This was Timur's very simple yet very effective system. If you are willing to show Timur your all, if you're willing to give him everything, then there would be no end to the rewards he would shower upon you. But if you faltered before him or betrayed him, there would be no mercy, only humiliation and death. And this will be a trait of Timur that we will continue to see until his very death, given to men, given to cities, and arguably even empires. It's a brutal system, but the system of a conqueror. Although the battle here had been won, the war was just getting started. So leaving the smoldering city of Kath in their wake, Timur's forces marched further into the heartland of Chorasmia, closer to the Aral Sea. Next in their target was the largest and most important city of Chorasmia, the city of Urgench. And it was here where Hussein Sufi was, now terrified of what might become of his capital, perfectly willing to cower behind his walls and soldiers. Timur's forces did the same thing they had done with Kath. They surrounded the city and the siege began. Thankfully, though, no battle was to be fought. During the early days of the siege, Hussein Sufi died. Perhaps he was assassinated by rivals unhappy with how the war was going. Perhaps he died of disease or of terror, as Yazdi tells us. We don't know. But with his death, his brother, Yusuf Sufi, took control of Chorasmia and very quickly sent Timur a message that he was willing to make peace. The diplomacy was a success, and Timur lifted the siege. But the terms of this peace were as follows. Timur and his army would leave Chorasmia, and Yusuf Sufi would keep control of his kingdom. However, the remains of the city of Kath and the southern portions of Chorasmia would be handed over to Timur. And then, in addition, Yusuf Sufi's daughter would be married to Timur's son, Jahangir. Now, a quick note here. I know we haven't talked about Timur's family much at all. That has been deliberate. I wanted to keep characters to a minimum in Timur's early days as a ruler, but very soon Timur's sons will begin to play very important roles in their father's empire. So soon, don't worry, we will meet Timur's family. But anyway, this concluded Timur's first invasion of Chorasmia. While not a complete conquest of the region, it had been a great victory for Timur. The appetites of the tribes had been satisfied for now, and Timur had further proven his role as a military commander. He could now return back to Samarkand as a victor. But before we end today's episode, there was one more problem Timur had to face, and that was what to do with Kaikhusra, the man who had promised to betray Timur but never had had the right opportunity to do so, as Timur really had only been victorious here. Now, how Timur found out about this conspiracy, we'll never know. And then, of course, there is the very possible situation that this whole conspiracy was made up by Timur in order to justify killing a former ally who might have been getting too much power and influence, and that could be a problem. Whatever the case, the details are lost, but here's what happened. Kaikhusra was seized and put on trial for conspiracy to commit treason. He was found guilty, he was stripped of all his titles and lands, which were given to more loyal men, and then Kaikhusra was executed. Executing a potential rival might temporarily help Timur out, but it's also sort of like cutting off the head of a hydra, causing two more heads to emerge, because although Kaikhusra was dead, his son, a man named Muhammad, was furious at how Timur had treated his father. Muhammad fled, and he knew exactly where he could find an ally to exact vengeance on Timur. He fled right back to Chorasmia, right to Yusuf Sufi, who was already planning to throw away this peace deal he had so recently made with Timur. Thus, this invasion is called the first, but more are soon to follow. Timur's war with Chorasmia had only just begun. This has been the Timur Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, a rating or review on whatever listening platform you use would be greatly appreciated. But some listening platforms don't have rating systems though, so don't fret if you can't find it. The fact that you're willing to listen to me ramble through this is more than thanks enough. If you want to reach out to me at any time or for any reason, always feel free to do so via my email at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Twitter or Facebook at Timur Podcast. Next time, the early wars of Timur continue as he must balance almost a three-front war. To the west, Khwarezmia will soon stir against him soon. To the east, Mogulistan is far from dealt with, and internally, Timur has to face his greatest threat, keeping the tribes satisfied in order to keep himself alive. Find out what happens next, right here on the Timur Podcast.